Hello, beautiful people of Trinity. Thank you for having me back for another class. I love teaching, and I love teaching you all, love being around you all. So I'm trying to channel you all, envision you maybe sitting at dinner, eating together, or sitting around the table in the Bishop Dagwell office, or Dagwell room, so we can see each other as we discuss what's a really heavy topic this time, actually. So that's what I'm picturing as I've been preparing and as I walk through this PowerPoint presentation. I'm picturing some of you, and I will do my best to imagine the questions that might come up as I go through this material, but I will also check back in to see what questions you all do pose, or you could email questions to me, I suppose. I'm not quite sure how they're handling that kind of a thing at this point, but I'll do my best to imagine the kinds of things you might want to pause on, to elaborate on. So let's get right to it, shall we? Yes, the topic for this 6-week class is Anti-Judaism and Acts. And so you might be really curious about how we have that particular topic. But before I explain that part, let's do a quick overview of the what I will cover tonight in week 1, the introduction. 5 quick topics. Of course, why this topic, and then 4 kind of setting the framework, as you might expect for something like this. We'll talk about the books of Luke and Acts together, why we know we can read them together. In particular, this third point, how to read Acts, that's actually one of the biggest components of tonight's presentation. Again, reframing how we think about what Acts is telling us, as well as a quick touching on some of the issues that come up when we compare Acts versus what's in the genuine letters of Paul, and then a quick narrative overview. That won't take very long. What you can expect then for the rest of the subsequent 5 weeks. As you know, if you've taken a class with me, I do like to have an idea of where we're headed, and I know the content that we will be discussing. But I'm also open to adjusting according to some of your questions. So this is the rest of what you can expect in this series. We will be talking about how the book of Acts depicts Jews and Judaism. We'll take a close look at a thorough kind of engagement with the story of Pentecost, a couple of Peter's speeches, the stoning of Stephen, and any other components that we might need to also look at to fill in this picture in the next 5 weeks. To that end, I also want to highlight up front, or show you up front, what I'm working with in terms of the books. And so if we'd been doing this in person, I would have been recommending that you all read through this book with me. It's The Acts of the Apostles, Taming the Tongues of Fire by Shelly Matthews, who is actually a friend of mine, a colleague friend of mine. See if I can do that without the glare on the front. Anyway, so this is not a Bible study so much as a study guide, but it is just incredible, great content, some great basic content, but also enough that's a little bit challenging in terms of new and or the way she's framing the fairly commonly understood content about the book of Acts, as well as some maybe new angles on some of what you may have heard before. So this is essentially setting the pace, setting the tone for what I'll be teaching. And then there are 3 other books that one specifically that I will be drawing upon. I don't think this was her dissertation. It's actually the same scholar, Shelly Matthews' Perfect Martyr, The Stoning of Stephen and the Construction of Christian Identity. So her second book, and I'm drawing a blank on the title of her first, but it was also on the book of Acts. heavy, but really important stuff, really important content there. And then I'm going to recommend, in case you're interested, and I will refer to these again at the end of the series, but there's violence in the Newer Testament. So it is edited by same woman, Shelly Matthews, and another colleague, Lee Gibson. So this would be by six or eight different scholars. There's a section within biblical studies scholars. There's kind of a group that have been talking their researches on this topic of Jewish-Christian relations, in particular at the within early Christianity. And this is one of several books that have come out of that collectivity. I'd also like to recommend, if you're interested in this topic in general, Jesus, Judaism, and Christian Anti-Judaism. Sorry about the glare there. Adele Reinhardt's in particular, I really like. I like her spirit. I like the work that she does. You can tell by her name, probably, she is a Jewish woman. She's a Newer Testament scholar, and she has done most of her work on the book of the book of the Gospel of John, and you might get to see my kitties during these few weeks because they just don't understand. I've been talking to my students all day because I was doing two classes synchronously with my UP students today. So I've been talking to this laptop all day, so it's done. It's time to talk to the kitties. So we'll see how that goes. This is Minerva, by the way. And here she comes again. So we'll see. You know how cats are, I imagine. Many of you do. Okay, love. Do you want to come sit here instead? Okay. So those are the books that I'm working with or might recommend. And there are other books, other articles and books that Matthews recommends within this. They aren't necessarily all accessible to the general public. You do have to have access to university library databases. So for some of them, so that's a bummer. But I can see what I can do if you're interested in some of the work that she recommends, which I will make available. I will make those lists also available to you all. So looking at this first question of why this topic, and I was actually looking in my emails this morning, trying to figure out when it happened. This kind of issue has been happening quite a bit lately, last few years actually, more so than perhaps than we've been aware of in the past. But, expressions of hatred towards Jews in various forms. And actually about a year ago, there were a spate of attacks on synagogues. I've been thinking about this a lot, and so when you sit in this for a while, it gets really heavy. It's heavy in general. So sorry in general for the heavy topic, but when things were happening about a year ago, I was seeing colleagues and friends trying to make information available in social media contexts. This image from Southern Jewish life that a friend posted here on Facebook, right? The picture of the front of the synagogue being spray painted in such a way is awful, right? It's quite discouraging. But it's also really, from my perspective as a biblical scholar, it's important from my perspective that people realize that there is more than just a seed for this kind of thinking within the Newer Testament writings, as well as within the early Christian church. So it isn't just, that's not the right way to read if you see such hatred towards Jews. No, actually, I think you can read the scriptures correctly and have quite a bit of venom towards Jews. And that, this is the day after Easter. Should be a beautiful day, theologically speaking, and I'm just quite heavy. I feel very heavy. So anyway, so I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry that it's difficult, but I asked to teach this because I want people to understand, right? And I think that a lot of people, very loving, kind, well-meaning Christians, just haven't been given a chance or the space to look at some of the things that are there and to see what it's saying in terms of Christianity in contrast to Judaism. So looking at this particular posting, a friend of mine posted, and this is a friend who's, she's a preacher. She's from a Baptist tradition, a cooperative Baptist tradition. She's ordained. She performed the first wedding between two women in Alabama a few years ago. It's a very progressive woman, but she's also a theologian, not a biblical scholar. And so when she can say something like, what a mind-bogglingly hideous thing to do, I agree with her. Don't get me wrong. But it also, from a very basic perspective, it shouldn't be all that mind-boggling. But then I look at the next slide that has how her friends responded. And again, obviously, this it's not a good thing. But I look at all of these friends and I look at their responses. No, how dare they? I remember, right? Never forget. I remember. I hope they find them and prosecute them to the fullest. Like, I read some of these responses. To me, so angry and so sad at the same time, right? Sick, horrible, makes me angry and nauseous. What's wrong with these people? And I sit there thinking, well, do you realize this is also a part of your tradition? So I'm not, this isn't me bashing anything. This is me wanting people to understand some things about what's going on in some of the Newer Testament writings. I do find this particular one interesting. This person quotes a bunch of scriptures to support Jews in particular, but it's interesting that she quotes from 1 Peter 2, since that is a Christian text that is one of the classic supersessionist texts. That is exactly the point, the problem here, right? That people would have express such animosity toward Jews, and she's trying to say she believes that Jews are beautiful and good are God's chosen people, and yet she's quoting a classic supersessionist passage. So it's complicated, right? And I did want to include the last bit here from that same post, where someone says, not denying the complexity, right, but standing in peace, for peace in the face of hate. Our city is no place for hate. Could we collectively draw an energetic, compassionate circle of love around them all? I thought that was a really lovely, actually, response to a horrible thing that was done. So here I am as a Newer Testament scholar wanting to talk about it a little bit. So that's what these 6 weeks are about. And I've said a couple times, actually, in the last 2 or 3 classes that I've been fortunate enough to be able to teach for you all, I've referenced Acts a couple times and have said, I really don't enjoy talking about Acts or teaching it. I don't teach it when I cover the Bible over at UP, partly because we're covering the whole Bible in one semester and you can't cover everything. And so I just choose not to talk about the book of Acts. But the main reason is because of this element, that the way people do misread it, first of all, but then secondly, how we do read it correctly and don't process how antagonistic some of that content is. So also, and this is more just it's not just a book or two in the Newer Testament, but it's also the early church tradition. So here a reference to Justin Martyr. Martyr is not his last name. He is called that because he was martyred. His dialogue with Trypho. I have you could just Google it, but I also have a website for it at the end of this presentation. Very long, very, very long this dialogue between Justin, who is a follower of Christ. He's a Jew. He's of the Jewish tradition that is the segment that does worship Christ. And he posits a kind of a normative Jew, if you will, at the time, a non-believing in Jesus Jew, and he has a conversation back and forth, as many men in particular did do at this point in time, as a way to explain the faith, talk it all through, talk through all of the objections and the reasons for believing what they believe. But it is complicated and it is in depth, and it's not a quick email back and forth. It's 140 chapters of some components of it, 500 words, some, several pages. So anyway, if you're interested in seeing some of the early church content to this end, and here's another, Melito of Sardis, who was a bishop, has an infamous Easter sermon that I have seen very conservative churches to this day referring to, very conservative. So parts of the church tradition, right? So that's the first part. Why this topic? It came up for me. One way that I could respond to the hatred was to talk about what's going on in the scriptures themselves. So that's the why. So let's move on to the second component, right, for tonight. And that is looking at Luke and Acts together. I'm assuming that many of you are already familiar with this kind of general concept of Luke and the book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, being kind of two volumes that go together. And so I want to cover just a few components of why we can look at them that way. And, I think I think it makes the two of them even more interesting and beautiful when you do that. But for those of you for whom maybe you haven't heard that, this is also just helpful information to know about these two books. So I'm just hitting the highlights. There's actually more to this, looking at these two as two volumes written by the same person, or at least of the same tradition. But really interesting pieces of this. The ending of Luke is actually, as we see with all four Gospels, there's some form of, except for Mark, of course, the two women run from the empty tomb afraid, but the other Gospels have some sort of interaction, right, between Jesus, the risen Jesus, and his disciples. And so the ending of Luke as the Gospel then is essentially recapped at the very beginning of the book of Acts, which is kind of interesting. Kind of a previously on whatever show you like to watch, right? This is where we left off, that kind of thing. So kind of a recap, but then it also is a very smooth transition into what goes on in the rest of the book of Acts. So specifically, what we see in the Gospel of Luke in terms of the things that Jesus does, performing miracles and exorcisms, things like that, that particular role and those things are then attributed to Peter and Paul in the book of Acts. So kind of a parallel, similar to what we saw with Moses and then Joshua, right? Moses, the giver of the law, parts the Red Sea, yada, yada. Joshua parts a smaller body of water, right, and all these things. So a way to show that continuation of the power or the tradition, if you will. So Jesus' fate, that's kind of how my colleague is summarizing it. But what happens to Jesus in that last week or so, and the way it all unfolds in Luke's gospel, is then something of a pattern, or something that we see also attributed to Stephen, Peter, and Paul. So kind of three big people within that tradition, if you will. Specifically, we can see that Jesus is sent by God, as are Peter, Stephen, and Paul, and they are sent with a prophetic message, right? The content is similar, but don't want to. I could go off into these little tangents on all this so easily, but need to stay focused here. Some sort of prophetic message, as in speaking the message of righteousness in the face of corruption, right? In particular, but also then Jesus is depicted in general being rejected by Israel, rejected by the leaders of Israel in particular, when it comes to Jesus. And the persecution in Jerusalem, obviously that's where Jesus is executed, is in Jerusalem. And when Jesus himself is throughout in particular the time in Jerusalem, the last week, he's accused of corrupting Jewish people and preventing others from paying taxes to Caesar. Just fun kinds of things to talk about in terms of what Jesus is up to in Luke's gospel. Those are the same kinds of things that Paul is accused of, and is a part of his being arrested, or for those similar concerns in the book of Acts. Most interestingly, I think, as I was kind of reviewing this content again, is looking at what. So this is, take a step back for just a moment. So going back to talking about the Gospels themselves, and how, generally speaking, most scholars agree that Mark's Gospel was written first, and that both Matthew and Luke used Mark's Gospel, right? And then added their own flair, added different stories, maybe had a different ending to some of the stories. So what we see in Mark's depiction of the crucifixion, the arrest, the trial, crucifixion, that kind of thing, is that Jesus he refers to the destruction of the temple. He's accused of blasphemy, and several of his accusers are characterized in the gospel, in Mark's gospel, as false witnesses. So those things are in the first source for the gospel story, right, that Luke would have then been drawing upon. But in Luke doesn't apply those things to Jesus. Luke takes those and applies those to Stephen in the book of Acts. Really interesting, because the depiction of Jesus in his arrest, and trial and crucifixion, he's very in control. It's really kind of interesting. But quite notable, right, that it seems that at the time that the guy was writing the book of Luke, the gospel, knew that this second volume was coming, right? Oh, just kind of interesting. So, broad brushstrokes, those are the themes and the things that show that these two books, Luke's gospel, the depiction of Jesus and his story, is then essentially a paradigm, or the same. That's those same themes, and the depiction of Jesus there is then applied directly to Peter and James and Paul and the important folks in that next generation of what happened after the resurrection of Christ. So now on to how to read Acts. So this is, kind of like we do when we talk about the Gospels, and we talk about, for instance, many of you, at least some of you that I know, right, grew up thinking about the Bible, the contents of the Bible, many different parts of it, however you were taught to think of it, right? Whether you're taught to think of Genesis 3 as what really happened, and, that whole Adam and Eve story, and that's, problematic in all of its own ways, but it's just really like historically accurate. This isn't a thing that happened that works because of them, that we're all sinful. Like, however you're taught to read that, like, it's just the way you were taught. And all these things, this applies to all these different parts of the Bible, right? And so when we talk about the Gospels, it can be really jarring to talk about it from an academic perspective, right? Because, for my formative years, I thought of it more or less as historically accurate. I don't remember someone telling me to think of it that way. I just did. So when we look at it and we see, oh, wait, it's a little uncomfortable when I see that maybe some of it isn't historically accurate. That jars something for me, because there are lots of things that were built on that idea or framework of it being historically accurate. So then you have to just rearrange a whole bunch of things in the way you think about this guy, Jesus. Not to say that we don't believe in him, it's just that we have to think about these stories differently in relation to him, right? So that's a little bit of what this might feel like, to talk about the book of Acts in this next section, what I want to cover. But I'd like to give you a couple minutes to collect your own thoughts about the book of Acts. So again, if you've had a class with me in person, you know that is a thing that I like to do near the beginning of the first class, is let's see what you come into this class thinking on whatever topic, right? So I'd like you to spend a couple minutes gathering your thoughts about what do you expect to find when if and when you read the book of Acts? Is it telling, how do you respond to the stories that are in the book of Acts? How do you categorize them or catalog them for yourself, right? If you hear them read, or if you hear references to the missions of Paul, or, right? What is that? How do you think about the stories that are in the book of Acts? What are they? How do they inform what you think? I'll be right back. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay. So one of the things that's helpful, really, the main thing about how people are set up to think of the book of Acts, first of all, most people think of it as being, an accurate account, as if someone was taking notes as it went through, as they went through, and which of course we know there wasn't, of course, not stenographer at work, right? And that's fun to say, but then we need to stop and think about, well, yeah, that's right. So what does that actually mean? What people have often then done is people often refer to what is at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke because they've figured out that these are two volumes that go together, and so the same kind of motivation that's behind Luke is then also behind the writing of the book of Acts. So let me read the first few verses of Luke, which does inform the way people usually think about the book of Acts. And it is helpful for us to try to actually use it to reframe the way we think of it, interestingly enough. So, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So we can then, yes, assume that the same things apply to the book of Acts, right? What's different here is what those things mean in context compared to how they might sound to us today. So, for instance, the reference to writing an orderly account does sound to me like someone has pulled all of the stories and we want to get it straight. We want to make sure we're telling it correctly, right? And that you may know the truth, that you would have the right information, the true information, the correct information. And so from my particular context in the 21st century, I'm thinking that Luke is being an excellent researcher and is telling it to the best of his ability, as close to how it went down as possible. That isn't necessarily what that language specifically would have been telling, is a nod to in the first century. So, for instance, some of the language that's being used there, the orderly account, that you may know the truth, or that you might have certainty about this message, about what you've heard, that's more about, that is tapping into literary devices and a way, when someone says that in the first century or prior to and after, right, they're talking about assuring someone who, by other pieces that we can tell from looking at both the book of Luke and Acts, that this is written to someone in a position of power. You're going to have to kind of go with me on that if you haven't already heard that or been shown how that's the case. But for various reasons, I think that this is trustworthy perspective on things. And so to a person in power, what is it that's reassuring? What is it that is going to reassure or feel like certainty? And in their context, that had more to do with this organization, this religious tradition, being led by men. That the organization itself was run in an orderly fashion, that they resolved their difficulties respectfully and thoroughly, that the men that led them would speak with boldness and speak with clarity, right? I'm actually going to read a couple times tonight from the book, and here's the bottom of page 5 of one of Shelly's books. Acts bears much evidence that it is written with the perspective of a high-status patron in mind, whether real or imaginary, and that comes from that conversation about who is Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus. I'm sure many of you have heard about that and probably worked through that before. is it an actual person or is it a figment as a stand-in? Either way, we have the same content. So we're going to move past that for tonight. To say this another way, Acts is written to affirm an elite sensibility of what a stable and legitimate social grouping in the ancient Roman world should look like. It is led by men, masculine is key, of course, who speak publicly with boldness, who resolve internal discord through careful deliberation, who do not engage in civic unrest in spite of being charged with it to begin with, and who practice a long-established form of piety based on the teachings of an ancient lawgiver. So all of those things the book of Acts does show us, absolutely. So an orderly account that you may know the truth, you may be rest assured about these things. This is more about telling the story of this group in a way that will appeal. Not, I'm telling you that I have the facts all figured out. So I'm going to move on to the next slide then that talks about this issue of the difference between what we might think of someone as telling the historical account, which is essentially what they're offering, right, in the book of Acts, and what an historian would be doing in the first century. It's very different, right? Similar to what we saw in the Gospels, where the Gospel writers are trying to depict a particular essence of the person, not just tell everything they can think of, that they can discover, right? Similarly, a historian is about persuasion, persuading you to believe, or some form of understanding the event, the war, the whatever, through this particular lens. And in particular, while we today might appreciate, respect, value innovation, and see it as something that might inspire us, right, to similar forms of innovation in other areas, in the context of social groups, keeping order within the empire, these things that would be important to someone of social status and power, the idea of showing this group as behaving and the people within it live and have experiences that are similar to other previous respectable people of our history. Imitation versus an innovation, right? Showing that these leaders, teachers are similar to other ancient philosophers and teachers. So we have Paul sounds quite similar to Socrates. Like the things that Socrates is charged with are some of the same things that Jesus is charged with, the same things that Paul is charged with in terms of, derailing the youth, right? We have the reference, really, really kind of fun and playful in the book of Acts, when we have these references to, there's a moment when Paul and Barnabas are thought to be a couple gods visiting, right? So the people, once they realize that these must be gods visiting in human form, they change and start offering sacrifices to him. That harkens back to other Greek writings and the concepts of the Greek and Roman gods, right? Visiting Earth, if you will. So there are several elements of the story, the book of Acts, that has this echoing back to older traditions or religious practices, but most definitely that it is not a new religion or a new tradition, but that it is very definitely standing on the shoulders of, even though it's merely just a branch of Judaism. So it isn't new, it is reflecting the things that people know and respect from of old. And this bullet point is probably the most difficult in terms of reframing, right? And that is that this last element of how to read Acts, when we talk about Luke, whoever he is, right, presenting an orderly account, right, so that you may trust that the things you've heard are trustworthy, right, it's legit, all these things. Luke is going to tell the story as it should have happened, even if that is not accurate. And that can feel really awkward to some people today for me to suggest that. But I'm not the one suggesting it. So that's part of what we'll be looking at when we do look at, for instance, the story of Pentecost. We will look at that in this class. Interesting that Pentecost will be happening 10 days after the end of this class. But, right, so the way the story is told in the book of Acts, in terms of historical validity, speeches that are delivered in the book of Acts, we know that ancient historians were honest about the fact that they can't be writing what actually happened, what was actually said. And so they're going to do the best that they can come up with to create a speech that might have happened at this point in time. Kind of like, it happens in movies, right? It's all quite really well planned. The when people get to make these speeches and how long they get to carry on and make all of their points, right? It's really lovely. It's a little bit too well timed and planned, right? Yeah, well, that's kind of the point. They're trying, the historian is trying to persuade, right? So what all of this means is that, maybe we should take it all with a little bit of a grain of salt instead of talking about it as if it really transpired the way it's depicted. There are two parts that Matthews points out that I think actually kind of point us to the next point. A couple things in terms of how to read Acts and the elements of what is depicted in the book of Acts that are meant to reassure are also parts of point number 4, which is the book of Acts versus, or in parallel to, if you will, instead of seeing this antagonistically, the book of Acts versus versus what Paul himself says. And so, again, this might feel like I'm trying to just be in your face about you've been reading it wrong. I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to talk about what's going on in the book of Acts. And so just hear that. And so let's look at a couple things in general. What we see time and again when it comes to Paul in the book of Acts is that he is depicted as quite a skilled orator. So hang on to that thing about the historian depicts things as they should have happened, regardless of whether or not they did. Okay? Right. Paul is a skilled orator. I mean, he has just the right thing to say at just the right moment, and he has the history of all of these different locations or the mythology that they're working with or the philosophical debate. Like, he can throw down rhetorically with anyone. Like, this guy is good. Which is interesting when you look at what Paul himself says about himself. And, sometimes I'm like, well, sometimes Paul might be being a little sarcastic, even if he is, even maybe in his own, like, overstating his weaknesses, right, to make a point. But he also, in 2 Corinthians 10, refers to how others talk about him. And they refer to him as having contemptible speech. Like, he's not very good as an orator. So which is it? Maybe he's overselling his weakness. Maybe he's not. Either way, I don't think both are historically true, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So there's that. So let's look at the next point here. The way Paul is talked about in the book of Acts it's really fun. I mean, it's really fun to read. And it's really fun to just kind of play along and let everything in Acts be true. It is. It really is. And in particular, this implies strength of body. That's in reference to the skilled orator. In terms of, historians of rhetoric and oration will, talk about, people having these debates in contexts where you do need to project, and it is a performance at times. It's not something just anyone can do. There is training involved, and it does require strength of constitution and physical strength. So that's an interesting part of the claims about Paul, is that one would think he's actually physically kind of impressive, but also the things that he is depicted surviving, right? He's depicted surviving a stoning, right? All but, 39 instead of 40, lashings, practically stoned and left to die outside the city, and then the next day or two just gets up and he's good to go. Like, really? But you can play along with the story, because at the time I'm just wondering where the story's going. But that's impressive. The shipwreck, and how he just steps up and takes over, and he takes care of everybody. He's been in chains. How do you survive a shipwreck? First of all, when you're in shackles to begin with, but let's just set that aside. And he leads the whole people, like he's in chains with the Roman guards, but he runs the show, and he makes sure that everybody gets there safely, and he makes sure, right? It's a great story, but take a step back and look, is that really how it would have gone down? In particular, even more so when you look at how Paul refers to things like his own weaknesses. You can take the thorn in the flesh to be whatever you want it to be. I don't have any dog in that fight, really. But he also, in the same passage in 2 Corinthians 10, refers, when he's quoting how others have spoken of him, that he's not a very good speaker, and that he's physically weak. His bodily presence is not impressive. And the later, the early kind of caricature is too negative, but, depictions of him are, short of stature, which, we could get into that another time, bow-legged, unibrow, big nose, all kinds of interesting things about him, but the guy's short and not very impressive physically, right? So which is it? Is he the guy who can, survive shipwreck after, is he this impressive Olympian, or is he just a regular person, right? Yeah, just things to think about in terms of what have you been told? How are you going to think about it differently? Is it, are you comfortable kind of leaving some space to think about things differently? Really interesting, and I don't want to dwell on this, partly because partly because it's the day after Easter, and I don't want to make a big deal of the crucifixion right now. Interesting, though, that in the book of Acts, that's never talked about, right? The reference to the crucifixion, the reference to this guy who died, that's not true. He is talked about, obviously, Jesus is talked about as having been killed. But the way it's never a part of what Paul is talking about in the book of Acts, whereas he refers to it quite a few times in the genuine letters, and refers to, I resolved to know that only this when I was with you, and that is Christ crucified, right? And he talks about his own weaknesses as being a place and a way for the crucified Christ to live in him, and to that then it is Christ resurrected, crucified and resurrected, that then can shine because of his weakness, right? So there's the depictions are different. How about we'll just leave it at that for now. Two different things going on there. And ultimately, one of the main purposes of the book of Acts is to show that this is a politically safe organization or religious movement. It is not going to threaten the political leader, the running of the empire, essentially. that it is safe. And that is precisely one of the things that Paul says it is not, right? His message mocks those in power, the message of Christ crucified specifically, right? So it isn't that they have to be mutually exclusive, right? Because they're talking about different things, right? I'm not trying to say that they can't both have an element of truth, because I think that they can. I do. But it's worth thinking about, right? And this is very specifically not to get into the way Paul himself talks about his epiphany versus the way the book of Acts depicts his epiphany, which is much more dramatic, and the timing. These two events, the event is described quite distinctly by Paul himself versus the writer of Acts. So again, I don't want to dwell on those pieces because that's not really what this class is about. But those are. And what I thought was quite convincing, I suppose you could say, and so worth just highlighting for you to think about, because these are things that people do tend to know about Paul or have in their mind somehow, especially people who do grow up well versed in Scripture, will usually refer to these things. So it's worth considering, right? So this is the last point within this issue of how to read the Book of Acts. What kinds of things how are you going to think about what we read, what we encounter, and what's being said? So Paul's pedigree, if you will. If you've ever heard, or if you've been told, right, that Paul studied with Gamaliel, a very highly respected Pharisee teacher in Jerusalem, right? Many people assume that to be true of Paul, right? Paul himself does refer to himself as a Pharisee, and a Pharisee of Pharisees, for sure. He does, in his genuine letters. But to say that he's a student of Gamaliel is, what would be the comparison here? Whoever the best in your field is, that you studied with that person, right? Not just that you studied medicine, but that you studied with the person who, is the best in whatever your field, right? Okay, so the best. Paul doesn't ever refer to Gamaliel. Paul doesn't ever refer to his specific training in that way. It's not impossible, but it's interesting that it's not noted. This is where I think maybe I will just read this section again. These things that people assume, know, believe, whatever, that he's from Tarsus, right? I've been to the city of Tarsus, the ancient city, and been to the place where supposedly the well he would have visited as a child, right? Is he really from Tarsus? Or is that a trump card to ascribe to Paul, to give him more validity, right, as an important person? The fact that he's said to be a Roman citizen, that comes only from the book of Acts. That isn't something Paul ever says of himself. Again, maybe it wasn't relevant in his letters, right? That's a legitimate thing to consider. But let me read to you from this book. This is page 16. How to assess these large and somewhat conflicting claims that Paul was a Jerusalem-trained Pharisee of the Pharisees, a full citizen of the glorious Greek city, and a Roman citizen by birth to boot. That Tarsus in the first century, in a sense, was a rival to, say, Athens or Alexandria in terms of being a large city, metropolitan, that kind of thing. So let me just keep going here for just a couple minutes. We need not doubt that Paul affiliated with Pharisees for at least a portion of his life. And I think that's absolutely true, because he does claim it, and it does make sense of his mission initially that changes. It is not absolutely impossible that a Jew of Tarsus could have been a citizen of that city, though such a citizen would have been counted among the most elite residents of the city, a status that does not fit with the claim that Paul worked as a tent maker, which is also a claim in Acts. So it's an interesting thing. Again, we could say, well, a lot of people, elite people, do give up their status in order to to be a part of a movement. So there's wiggle room here. Nor is it out of the realm of possibility that a diaspora Jew in the middle of the 1st century could have held Roman citizenship. Each identity claim, standing on its own, while not plausible, is possible. What strains credulity to the breaking point is the idea that Paul could have held each of these 3 highly coveted status markers: a Pharisee trained in Jerusalem by Gamaliel, a full citizen of the Greek city of Tarsus, and a Roman citizen by birth, not by purchase, simultaneously. For the citizenship claims to be credible, Paul would have to have been born into one of the most elite governing families of Tarsus. But where evidence of highborn Jews entering into full citizenship of a Greek city occurs, it is accompanied by signs of assimilation or integration into Greek customs. Pharisees, by contrast, and quite pointedly, are noted for zealous adherence to particular Jewish practices, a position that is quite the opposite of assimilation and accommodation to non-Jewish culture. So, historically speaking, the claim that he's a citizen would mean he's likely quite Greek. But he's very adamantly a Pharisee. Luke's overriding concern here seems not to be with providing historically accurate data concerning Paul's pedigree, but with asserting in every instance and within every social circumstance that Paul is simply among the best of the best with regard to education, piety, wealth, and status. And that, in and of itself, then, does also, right, work with what we talked about, or what I pointed out earlier, right, that the historian is trying to reassure and persuade. And in this particular instance, what he's trying to persuade Theophilus, a real person, or just any given person who's heard about this movement, this religious movement, the assurance that this is a legitimate and stable movement, resolves its problems, right? Very reasonable, right? All come together. Which, if you look at the real Paul, they do not reason things out, and they do not resolve their problems reasonably or politely or any of those things. Whatever. So, we are now to point number 5, the narrative overview. The book itself, the book of Acts, 28 chapters. We will spend quite a bit of time actually looking at the Jerusalem section, for various reasons. But so there are 4 primary components, if you want to break it down, of the book of Acts. The Jerusalem section, the first 8 chapters, or first 7 plus, that's where you're going to have the very opening, the parallel to the ending of Luke. And Jesus is present right there at the beginning of the book of Acts, and he tells his disciples that you will be you will take the message to the Gentiles, and I feel like I should read that part just very quickly here. Let's just read real quickly the opening of the book of Acts. In the first book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus did and taught from the beginning until the day when he was taken up to heaven after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. After his suffering, he presented himself alive to them by many convincing proofs, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. While staying with them, he ordered them not to leave Jerusalem, but to wait there for the promise of the Father. This, he said, is what you have heard from me. For John baptized with water, but you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit not many days from now. So when they had come together, they asked him, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel? He replied, it is not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And that also becomes kind of a template for what the book of Acts then shows, right? When he had said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. While he was going and they were gazing up toward heaven, suddenly 2 men in white robes stood by them. They said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up toward heaven? This Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." And so forth. And it just kind of leads really, kind of melds really nicely into the rest of the narrative. It's really lovely. Nice little segue, right, to do that. So we have that commission, that Jerusalem, Judea, and to the ends of the earth. And that's very clearly how it progresses in the book of Acts. But this is also the section where we have, this is where you have the story about Pentecost. This is the place that we get at least one, maybe 2 really powerful speeches from Peter, which is content I'd like to look at with you. And we do get kind of the final event of this section is the stoning of Stephen, which is watched over by Paul, right? So that's the first Jerusalem section. The second section then is kind of this transition, loosey-goosey couple chapters where it does kind of shows the handing of the baton from the Jerusalem leaders, meaning a handful of disciples of Jesus, specifically Peter and James, and their connection to Paul. So we get the first version of Paul's experience. I don't like to call it a conversion because I don't think that's what it is, but that's how it's depicted. So all of those events take place in this kind of transition section. It's in this section that we get the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, if you're familiar with that, and this story of Philip coming up alongside him, and the eunuch just happens to be reading just the right passage of Isaiah, and there just happens to be a pool of water by the road in the desert. All these things about the story are just perfect, right? Telling the story as it should have happened. And as soon as Philip baptizes the eunuch, the Spirit transports him. I love the fact that we can read that without really thinking about the fact that that's just kind of impossible. But it's a lovely part of the story, right? So all of those things, right? So there's an element of taking the message to the ends of the earth, that you have this Ethiopian, right, going with the message. And there is also this example of violence towards the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, right? James is beheaded and Peter's taken to prison. The third section then is what many people know of. This is where we get the 3 missions, or however you want to talk about it, the 3 trips, 3 adventures, however you want to look at it. So Paul and Barnabas initially. This is where we get the story of the council in Jerusalem that takes place with Paul, who is from Syrian Antioch, visits the leaders, the pillars in Jerusalem. So the coming together of the minds, right, and the agreeing on who is going where with what message, that takes place at the beginning of Paul's mission, that section. And then, of course, the final 8 chapters, which is a big significant component of it, right, is Paul in Roman custody. And so, again, there is content, there are stories here. He is quite eloquent, right? Is that true to who Paul was, or are we telling the story we'd like you to know? We'd like this to be the story. This is where he's shipwrecked near the very end, of course, and he's the hero who saves the day. But also, quite tellingly, through all of these sections, actually, all of these leaders, whether it's Peter or Paul or Stephen, are being actively combated by non-believing Jews. So Jews who are of the Judaism they've always been a part of, in contrast to this new sect of Judaism, which is worshiping Christ, Jesus as the Christ. That these other Jews are constantly attacking or trying to stop, attack, or have them killed, the people who are of this sect, this other sect of Judaism that becomes known as Christian. And that is true from beginning to end of the book of Acts. So, that's the narrative overview, and I am going to wrap up here. If, for those of you who are looking for something to do, you could get the book the primary book that I'm using. I've just covered, in a sense, the introduction, the primary questions, and the narrative overviews, the first couple chapters of this, by Shelly Matthews. You could also read through the book of Acts, and there are a lot of really fun and interesting stories in there. If you're going to do that for the sake of this class, I would encourage you to do it with an eye toward what you know of, and you might not know of much, and that's okay. But if you are familiar with Scripture, where are the places that things that are Jewish? I don't mean that derogatorily, but Jewish people, scriptures, ideas, when are they being referenced? And just make a note of that, right, as you go through. It might be just eye-opening for you to do that. Also, here's the dialogue with Trypho, Justin's dialogue. You could just Google Justin Martyr dialogue with Trypho. That will give you it'll probably pull this one up at the top of that list. So, other than that, I will look for questions on YouTube, or maybe from some of you, if you contact Matthew, however that works out. I'll figure this out to see if there's some questions that you have that I did not address that I can in future classes here. Thanks for your attention. I will see you later.